Hello, welcome to The Current. This is the North Central Region Water Network's Speed Networking webinar series. I'm Rebecca Power, joining you from the University of Wisconsin-Madison Division of Extension, and I will be your moderator for today. Joining you from southeastern Wisconsin, though I'm located on the UW-Madison campus. So some of you may be new to the North Central Region Water Network. We are an extension-led collaboration among 12 universities and our partners in 12 upper Midwestern states. And today I'm excited that we have a program for you, looking at some research on conservation practice efficacy, and then a couple of talks about how funding and financing mechanisms can support conservation practice implementation when we know what works. So I'm gonna jump right in to our format here and to the content of our presentations to give you as much time at the end with our speakers. But before we introduce them, this is relatively new for our format. We're on Zoom webinar now, where we used to be on a different framework. So you can, at the end of the presentations, our three presenters, you can submit your questions for them in the Q&A panel, which you should be able to access in a toolbar on the lower portion of your screen. And we will, because this is our speed networking webinar session, we will have relatively short presentations from each of our presenters, and then try to give you as much time for Q&A as possible. If you are experiencing any technical issues or have questions that we can help answer, you can use the, that are not related to the presentations, you can use the chat feature for that. And that chat feature is also accessible at that lower portion of your webinar screen. So use the chat for logistics and technical issues, and use the Q&A for the questions for our presenters. If you're having audio issues, a phone-in option can be accessed by clicking the up arrow on the mute icon, and then clicking switch to phone audio. We do record these sessions, and they are available at northcentralwater.org. We also live tweet them, so you can follow us on Twitter, and we welcome you to contribute any interesting tidbits that you're learning today. So with that, our presenters. We are lucky to have with us today Ricardo Costa from Michigan State University, Alejandro Plastina from an extension economist from Iowa State University, and Keegan Kalt, the executive director of the Agricultural Drainage Management Coalition. And now for our first presenter. So Nora, I don't read these word by word here. There's great information about what Ricardo has to offer, his experience working in Michigan, and a diversity of different perspectives that he brings to the conversation, and particularly related to Lake Erie in this case. So with that, I will turn it over to Ricardo and stop sharing my screen here so Ricardo can share his.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. Appreciate the introduction there. And if you guys give me a few seconds, we're going to start running here right now. All right, so thank you everybody that joined us today. Appreciate it. I saw like over 100 people that I'm happy with that. So my talk today will be related on what are our ag folks' efforts on reducing phosphorus losses on the Western Lake Erie Basin, okay? So to start off, I cannot start this presentation without seeing a picture of algae bloom on Lake Erie. If you know anything about Lake Erie, you probably know about the algae bloom that we have, right? You probably also saw on the news a lot of talks about the Toledo water crisis back in 2014. You probably saw the reports talking about that. For you folks that are down south, the difference is among your algae bloom and ours. Ours is caused by phosphorus, all right? And I know you folks is more like nitrates. So to give you some background information, we have what they call total phosphorus, right? And that's a combination of particulate phosphorus and dissolved phosphorus. When it comes to algae bloom on Lake Erie, particulate phosphorus is not a main issue anymore because levels have been going down for the past few years. On top of that, particulate phosphorus is not as reactive to algae bloom when you compare to dissolved phosphorus. Our main issue is that guy over there, it's dissolved phosphorus. So now we know that phosphorus is what causes algae bloom on Lake Erie. But where is that coming from? Well, we have two different ways. The first one is from what we call point source. Like the name says, basically like when we know what is the source of pollution. It can be either like a pipe that are coming from a factory, maybe plants where we work with sewage. But to be honest to you, they're not as important when it comes to throwing phosphorus on Lake Erie. Our main issue actually comes from what we call non-point sources. And like the name says, there is not a single point where that pollution is coming from. So as non-point source, I can give you examples. Water runoff from rainfall, also water runoff from streets, from your lawn. But guess what? Our main issue, our main contributor to as a non-point source of phosphorus in Lake Erie comes from what? Agricultural lands. So that's where we need to do our work here, because that's what we're trying to stop. And of course, now you know we have phosphorus coming from non-point source. That's what make that water become green, and I'm pretty sure you're not going to want to drink that water, right? So to give you some perspective, that's what we call Western Lake Erie Basin drainage area. We have some rivers in the area. The main feeder when it comes to phosphorus in Lake Erie is Maumee River. Our main work here, because you're in Michigan, not in Ohio, right? We are all very focused on river raising, and also have been doing some work on St. Joe's watershed. That's not the same one that goes to Lake Michigan. This one goes down to Maumee to the down south. So what have you been doing here? So we talk about, I explain a little bit about our main issue. Well, our main focus that we have been doing here down in Southeast Michigan, we have a lot of grants where we give farmers the opportunity to work and to try conservation practices to reduce the phosphorus getting in the lake. So we have different grants, and most of these grants we got in partnership with the Institute of Water Research at MSU. And again, they are different grants, but the goal is the same. We wanted to co-share those practices so farmers, they can try, and hopefully they're going to see they work, and they want to keep doing that for long term. So our work, we are focused in three main legs, okay? First thing is we do extension. So we do education and outreach. So we talk about nutrient management, and we're talking about conservation practice. Extension does that. Other partners, they also do that throughout the year. So that's a big thing of our work. But also we are very focused on nutrient management and conservation practice, because again, remember, let's go back to the beginning of the presentation. We wanted to stop phosphorus getting in the lake, right? Dissolved phosphorus. So how we do that? How we work with nutrient management and conservation practice? We co-share. We help farmers to try those practices. And again, like I mentioned before, to adopt those and use as a long term. I have a list of a few practices we pay for in different grants. As you saw, we have a different grants where that money will come from. But if they're doing a no-till, we can pay them. If they are doing a cover crop, if they are doing yield monitor, calibration, VRT, all depends. We have different prices. Some of those prices, they come from match that NRCS have, or also we have a Lake Erie here, actually a river raising. We have like a model where we can calculate how much phosphorus we can stop from getting in the lake, and actually you pay you based on that number. That being said, let's go to what matters here today. We have been doing that for a long time, and what we have learned. And I want to share with you our successes and challenges throughout those few years. First thing is, it's very hard to predict adoption rates. You can write a grant, you can put thousands of dollars out there, you can try to predict, but whenever you have the work done, applications are coming in, you realize that a lot of times they don't match with what you had in mind. That takes us to something that's very close with that. It's actually some practices, some conservation practices are way more successful than others. And like, for example, one of our grants we are paying for cover crops. We have is a very successful project. In another grant, we are paying for farmers to update their machines. And of course, so that's huge as well here. But there are some other practices where we don't get a good response. So we learn on the go. We have to make adaptations on the go. And that takes us to the third thing we learn. And I actually want to ask you, if you're dealing with grants in your area related to conservation practice, if you could please put in your Q&A box over there and tell me what you have been doing to be able to surpass that challenge. For us here, we do a very amazing job in recruiting folks that we are like-minded, in getting folks that actually they care about conservation practices, that they care about nutrient and management. Folks that come to our meetings, folks that come to local meetings, we do a good job. We have those folks coming to and applying for those grants. That being said, we are not as successful in recruiting folks that they are not coming to extension meetings. So we a lot of times we joke, we always be recruiting the same folks that are coming to apply for our grants. So one thing we are thinking about future now, we should do a better job in connecting with industry. We do an amazing job in working with other agencies, but maybe with industry is the way that we can get at those farmers that they do not come to our meetings or they don't walk to their local conservation district. So even though that farmer does not come to an MSU meeting, they still need to buy fertilizer, they still need to buy herbicide, they still need to buy seed, and they're going to do that through the local co-ops. That's where we need to strengthen our partnership. And I want to ask you guys if that's what you guys do to reach out to folks that they are not coming or they're not applying for your grants. If you can put that in your Q&A box, I would love to read that later. Another thing is, we love to see that we have farmers that are applying for those grants. We love to see good numbers to report saying that we decrease the amount of phosphorus getting in the lake by N% or by any thousands of pounds. But the goal of those projects actually is to change attitude, not only for 1, 2, 3 years that we have that grant going on. We want to use it as a jump start. Farmers, they are able to apply, they see the practice to work, and they want to keep doing that for the rest of their time farming. And last but not least, I can't stress that enough. Partnership is key. Institute of Water Research at MSU, they could come up with $1 billion of grants, but without having partners with their boots on the ground, helping us to recruit farmers, helping us to spread out the word, we would not be as successful as we are today. So our goal, a lot of work here is building up partnerships. A lot of our work is actually strengthening those relationships. We need to have a clear communication between us, MSU Extension, and those partners, because that's actually what make or break our success when it comes to those conservation practice grants. With that, I'm pretty much done here. And if you have questions later, I'll be more than glad to answer at the end of the webinar.
Thank you, Ricardo, so much. Okay, and if you do have questions for Ricardo, please go ahead and submit them in the Q&A box that should be, or a Q&A icon that should be available in the lower portion of your panel. And now on to our next presenter, Alejandro Plastina. And Dr. Plastina is an associate professor and extension economist at Iowa State University. His areas of specialization include agricultural production and technology with an emphasis on farm business and financial management. So with that, go ahead, Alejandro.
Thank you very much, Rebecca, and good afternoon, everyone. Let's see if I can share the screen. Can you see that?
Yes.
Okay, thank you, Rick. So I want to discuss very briefly so we can leave time for questions and answers later. how to incorporate conservation practices into farmland leases. And this is an educational presentation, and it's not intended to be legal advice. So what do we know about leasing? And why is leasing relevant to the conservation discussion? Well, first of all, nationwide, 31% of the farms and 65% of the farmland are operated by farmers who rent all or part of the land they operate. In Iowa in particular, based on a 2017 survey, we know that 53% of the farmland is leased, and 44% of the leased farmland is on a cash rent. I'm sorry, there's something on the screen. Okay, no. And then 69% of all the cash rented acres use written leases. So we have here the tools to use to actually enhance the adoption of conservation practices via written leases. So what we have here is the way we can incorporate conservation practice into a farm lease is either by creating a new lease, doing away with the existing lease, terminating the lease, and creating a new one, or modifying an existing lease, and that would be through a new addendum or insert. Now, if you choose to create a new lease, then you have to be very careful about the provisions related to leasing in each of the states, including the termination notice deadline, the language, and so on. But before creating or modifying a lease, we have to have a game plan, right? And the first question to ask is what type of conservation practice really works for you, you being the landlord or the tenant, and for the specific farm. And there are plenty of resources out there to help you decide which conservation practice is right for a farm. Now, once you decide which one is most convenient to you and your farm, then you should communicate with the other party, right? And that's a very difficult discussion to have, but it's important to evaluate the expectations of both parties, and not only the agronomic expectations, but if there are any land easements that need to be taken into account, the contract length, and we know that most conservation practices require multi-year leasing contracts, and then the rights and duties, how those are distributed between the two parties. Then there are plenty of monetary incentives out there. So how to use those? There are non-monetary incentives. For example, if a landlord decides to extend the contract length, if the tenant then if there's a change of practices being discussed, well, what about sharing risks between the parties? So moving away from a fixed cash rent and discussing a flex lease, where the flex is on yields or on revenue. And then what happens if things go wrong? So if there's an early termination, death of one of the parties, or bankruptcy, so having a contingency plan is critical. Once you agree, both parties agree on the on what you want to do in that farm in terms of conservation, it's very important to remind ourselves that both parties need to file a conservation plan with the Farm Service Agency if the interested parties are want to participate in the farm safety net, and that's ARC, PLC, and subsidies in the crop insurance program, for example. So if the operator wants to keep participating in those programs, then it's important to have a conservation plan filed with FSA. Once that's done, it's important to put everything in writing and have it signed by all parties. So I want to share with you some of the language that is already included in the standard farm list template that is available in the Ag Decision Maker website. That's developed by Iowa State University. So this language is related to conservation practices, and it goes like this. The operator agrees to farm the land in an efficient and steward-like manner, and that could have to do with limiting the amount of acres planted in each year to crops. The operator agrees also to provide an annual report, including a summary of the chemical used, some of the practices, production practices that is, and yield information with the owner by certain time of the year. Do what is reasonably necessary to control soil erosion, and that includes maintenance of existing water courses, waterways, ditches, drainage areas, terraces, and tile drains, and abstaining from any practice which will cause damage to the real estate. And of course, the operator is not expected to do major reconstructions of those structures, but it is expected, the operator is expected to maintain those. The operator is also requested to protect all desirable vegetation, including grassed waterways, wildlife cover, shrubs, trees, and maybe both parties can agree on refraining from doing some practices that could disturb permanent vegetation. Both parties can also agree on a mutually acceptable tillage program, and that tillage program has to agree with the requirements as prescribed by the Natural Resources and Conservation Service Conservation Plan. Then both parties can also agree on having the soil tested every so many number of years. In the standard template, it shows every 4 years, and have the results tested. So it can be just fertility or more in-depth kind of tests going into soil health. And then the operator must agree to comply with all regulations governing all activities related to farming, right? So application of pesticides, livestock manure, and commercial fertilizers, and the cultivation of crops. So that's part of the language that can be used in a standard lease to refer to general good conservation practices. But if we want to go further and discuss specifically, for example, the use of cover crops, then this insert provided by the Nature Conservancy at Purdue University, I think does a good job at describing all the details that could be included in a contract. And among those details are the agronomic implications, the specific acres and dates that will be used in the contract, describing any cost share that might occur, the length of the addendum validity that might be different from the length of the entire contract. Of course, it needs the signature, and it has to have very clear who pays for what, right? And there are a number of alternatives to have these costs shared between both parties. So it might be that first the rental rate for the operator on those acres under conservation practices. The owner might choose to lengthen the lease, or it might be that the operator would bear all costs, or the owner might bear all costs, right? But that must be stated in the contract. Now, that's usually very useful for short-term, let's say annual conservation practices. But if we are thinking about multi-year conservation practices or improvements, such as ponds, denitrification basins, and bioreactors, then we need a contract that allows for that multi-year characteristic of the improvement or the practice, and also depreciation through time, right? So there's an addendum for conservation practices and improvements also in the Ag Decision Maker website that pretty much has the language that I share with you in this slide. So first of all, there's a specific description of the farm. Then there's a list of improvements or practices that are agreed upon, the date by which those practices will be put in place, and then the total cost and the share of those costs borne by the tenant, net of any cost share payment. The years of amortization, if these are multi-year, it's important to understand that the value of these assets will be reduced each year a little bit. The annual amortization related to the number of years of amortization on the value of the asset, the year when the amortization begins, and that is useful. And we need to include all this in the addendum, because if the tenant leaves the farm before the end of this addendum, the life of this addendum, then the owner will have to repay the tenant for the unused portion of the investment, right? So how does this work? Well, basically we have a table with all these items that I just described. And you can see from the type of and location of the improvement, the date to be completed, the costs, in third part, then the cost borne by the tenant, and at the bottom, the amortization and signatures. And after the signatures, the last three columns are used to calculate the remaining value to be paid by the owner to the tenant in case the contract or the addendum is terminated before the original end date. So let's do a very quick example, and let's move on to the next presentation. So what I'm trying to do here is to go through an example that shows how the repayment from the owner to the tenant would work in case of a long-term investment where the costs are shared between both parties. So the type of improvement we are discussing here is a bioreactor, 100 feet by 30 feet in a specific farm draining 40 acres into a particular creek. The date of completion will be December 1st, 2021, for a total cost of $10,000. And that's only materials, because an external company will do all the work, and the tenant agreed to pay for 25% of those costs. So in column F, we have that the tenant paid $2,500. Now, this bioreactor will be amortized or depreciated over 10 years, and that corresponds to an annual amortization of the cost borne by the tenant, equivalent to $250, right, per year. And the amortization begins in 2022. So we have both signatures, landowner and tenant, and that's it. That's how the addendum should work when it's signed. Now, let's fast forward 5 years, and now the lease ends in 2025. So the accumulated amortization by that time, 4 years at $250 per year. It's 5 years at 4 years at $250 is $1,000, and the remaining value from the $2,500 minus $1,000 is $1,500, and that's what the owner should repay the tenant according to these addendum. Now we do that. We do have these addendums in order to incentivize sharing long-term investments, and I think that's what we wanted with this presentation. I look forward to our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alejandro. And oh dear, hold on just 1 second. We practice this and then we hit the wrong button sometimes. So let me. There we go. Okay. I'm going to share my screen again. And I just really want to thank Alejandro, you for your work and for making these linkages that those of us are doing more on the conservation side, making those linkages to the farm management side and how important these resources are. I did not know they existed before talking to you, so I just really appreciate you taking time to share those with our folks. And since I didn't share your introduction visually beforehand, you get to see too what an award-winning educator and researcher Alejandro is at the bottom there of his introduction. So thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, and on to our final presenter, Keegan Kalt. So Keegan was not so newly minted anymore, but relatively newly minted executive director of the Agricultural Drainage Management Coalition. And ADMC is an industry-led organization contributing to the development of best management practices such as drainage water management, saturated buffers, and bioreactors. So, and Keegan is going to tell us about some work that they've been doing related to, I think, the financing of some of these practices. So I will stop sharing my screen so Keegan can take it away.
Yeah, thanks, Rebecca. Does that look right to everybody?
It does.
Oh, great. Yeah, thanks for the invite. Always kind of keep in touch with who's on the current. And so I was excited to actually be asked to participate this week. ADMC, we're very excited to talk about a project. We maybe should have come up with a better name for it, but we're pretty simple, I suppose. And it's the Polk County Saturated Buffer Project. And really this project was aimed at going beyond the demonstration phase for these edge of field practices and really going to see what it would take to get to full scale implementation. And the Polk County Saturated Buffer Project really started a few years ago when there was a newly elected county commissioner, and he was making the rounds, trying to make connections with different conservation groups in the area to figure out what maybe Polk County's 5-year, 10-year plan would be and what they could do. And he had a watershed coordinator that was having trouble selling these edge of field practices. So this commissioner set up a meeting with ADMC's board president at the time, Charlie Schaefer of AgriDrain, to talk about what they could possibly do and what it would look like to have a project to actually get these things into scale. So we sat down and tried to figure out as many of the barriers that we've seen before for these practices and what could we do to address those barriers. All right, so where the project's located, Polk County, Iowa, the capital of Iowa, Des Moines, in the metro area is in this county, so it's the most populous county in the state. We did select 3 watersheds in the county to roll this out in, and it actually spills over a little bit into Dallas County, which is always confusing when you're talking to the landowners about the Polk County project, and they're in Dallas County. But anyways, there's 3 watersheds that we were doing work in: Walnut, 4 Mile, then the Mud Camp, Spring Creek watersheds. They ranged in size from about 53,000 to 76,000 acres, but all of the watersheds did have watershed management authorities within them, or they belong to a watershed management authority, and they've all gone through watershed management planning process. So there were plans in place that called for 100+ of these edge of field practices in all these watersheds. So we were trying to figure out how to make that happen. So in Polk County, before this practice, you know, the way to treat tile outlets before was the typical cost share. They did have a state funding through the Iowa Department of Ag and Land Stewardship's Water Quality Initiative funding model, which is very good to work with, a very flexible program. They also had funding through just the typical NRCS EQIP funding. A lot of this was opportunity based. You know, if a farmer's coming in looking for, they had a resource concern, they could address it through conservation planning. The result of this was there were 6 outlets that were treated with either a saturated buffer or a bioreactor over about 5 years, which is, you know, not very fast when you're thinking about trying to get 100 of these things in. We don't want this to take 100 years, but honestly, 6 outlets in a county, that was probably one of the leading counties in the nation almost, probably top 10 anyways, for having these practices in place. But we obviously know we need to do a better job of getting more of these outlets treated. So we sat down and took a look at the barriers that this watershed coordinator was having. And one of the biggest things that she thought was that the outlets were just getting lost in all the other conservation practices that were available to the farmer. So they would go through the full conservation planning process. And by the time we get down to treating the outlets, the farmer might not be interested anymore, or they might already be thinking about another practice already. So they never really get to that point. Plus, these farmers are all pretty smart, and they see some of the red flags with the practices of the hassle factors. You know, each one of these needs a PE design behind them. So you have to deal with getting a designer in place and having that PE approval, getting NRCS approval. Also, they realize they're going to have to hire and manage a contractor to put this in for them. And all of that for a practice that really doesn't benefit them in the field, but benefits down field, made them very hesitant to sign up for these practices. We also had a lack of interest from the contractors in the area to do it, just because popping 1 or 2 of these in the ground at a time really doesn't make much business sense for them. Whereas we might be excited that we have a very cost-effective practice that may be around $4,000 a piece for saturated buffer. For a contractor to want to take time out of their schedule to slow down and maybe doing one of these for a $4,000 doesn't really make much business sense for them. But all this led up to just not reaching the local goals. So with the Polk County project, we sat down, we kind of looked at the resources that we had available to us, and we thought we'll set a goal of 25 saturated buffer sites in a year. That's kind of the going from the crawling stage, I would say, that we were at before, to maybe the walking, maybe not quite running yet, but we didn't know if we could get to running. So we thought 25 was a good goal. We had the resources available to us to do that. In order to make this happen, we wanted to look at ACPF outputs, make sure the watersheds that we selected had a high amount of identified saturated buffer sites. With those identified saturated buffer sites, we did a direct outreach campaign to those landowners by sending them a letter and a follow-up phone call. We also wanted to create demand by incentivizing participation and streamlining the process as much as possible for the landowner. We realized that we wanted to remove that hassle factor for them. And actually, and not just cost share for the practice, we had a temporary construction easement. So it's a payment to the landowner for participating through this temporary construction easement. We thought this would, in the long run, would save the project money because we'd get more demand for it. So we catch some economies of scale. So we thought we'd be able to cut down on the design costs, because instead of sending an engineer out there to design 1 or 2 practices, now we were sending them out there to design 10+ practices at a time. And same on the contractor side, if they had a lot of sites to install, we thought it would come down on a cost per project basis. Also, we wanted to recruit landowners and farmers to install multiple saturated buffers. We know that these practices work, the science is there, so we don't really need to dip our toe in the water anymore. So if a farmer was interested in doing one, why not do as many outlets as they had that would meet the criteria for a saturated buffer? I always tell the story, nothing's worse than being at a field day where we're installing one of these and all of a sudden another landowner will look up the stream and like, well, this is great, we treated this one outlet, but I see 4 more right here. What are we doing about that? So we wanted to address that question. Then finally, we innovated a fiscal agent model to be able to bundle as many of these sites as we could together, just to make that package more attractive to the contractors, and also take that out of the hands of landowners so they didn't have to deal with managing a contractor. So this is just an example of what we mailed out to every landowner that had an ACPF hit on their land that they owned. So we sent them a mailer with 3 pieces of mail in it. Let's see if my mouse isn't quite working, but yeah, there we go. So we sent them 3 documents. We had a quick fact sheet on just what the practice was. That fact sheet, we tried to lay out a little sense of urgency, saying how invested the state of Iowa is in these edge of field practices, how interested the state of Iowa is in getting these to work. We also included a map of the field that we were talking about, realizing that these landowners have multiple fields. We thought it'd be much easier for that conversation if they actually had a picture of what we're talking about taking a look at. Then also in the letter, we identified lead project staff that would be contacting that landowner. And we were also very intentional with calling those landowners within a week of sending them this mailer. It's something that sounds very simple, but I think it gets lost a lot of times. We actually planned out ahead of time when we'd mail out batches of these letters to the landowner to make sure we could actually call them within 3 to 5 days of sending it. And I think this really helped because then it was fresh in their mind. And the only thing that we really wanted to accomplish with that first initial phone call was just to gain permission to come on and walk their fields, to identify outlets, and to see if it was feasible for a saturated buffer or not. We weren't locking them into anything. And we found that a majority of landowners actually let us do that. The financial assistance model that we're talking about, this is kind of a traditional project in Iowa where you have multiple funders. A landowner would have to have an agreement with each of the funding agencies. They'd also have to go out and have their own contractors. So there might be multiple contractors being hired. And then the contractor would have to install the practice, bill the landowner. Landowner has to pay the contractor and show that they made payment, and then they can apply for reimbursement from their funding agencies. Obviously, this is another big hassle, and it doesn't make sense when we're trying to install multiple of these sites at a given time. We thought that would be a nightmare to keep track of all of that. So we were able to develop this fiscal agent model where the fiscal agent in this situation was Polk County itself, the Public Works, had agreements with all the funding agencies, and then they had agreements with the landowners to the landowners assign payment from these different funding agencies over to the fiscal agent. And then the fiscal agent made all these bid packages that went out directly to a contractor. So now the contractor can just bill the fiscal agent and receive payment and not have to worry about landowner 2 or 3 not paying them back for a couple months and not gumming up the works. Status of this, like I said, our initial goal was 25 sites. We had more sites than what we knew what to do with, actually. Moving forward, we have 41 saturated buffers and 10 bioreactors going in this summer, hopefully. They all should be installed by December, but the contractor plans on breaking ground here in June. We had access to over 100 tile outlets, actually. So unlike many projects, we were able to be picky with the sites that we did, and actually we turned quite a few down. If we had more funding, we might have actually done more in year 1. We're actually doing a year 2 of this because we had so much demand for it. We're working with 15 different landowners. We do have one contractor that got all 3 of the bids. And so we're excited about that as a well-qualified contractor. And he actually came in under bid. And so that is good. It shows that maybe this model is a little bit more cost effective because we put those bids together looking at what the typical rates were to install one of these practices at a time. So we're very excited about that. Here's just the coverage map of all the sites that are going in this 4 Mile Creek watershed. We have 41 practices going in about a 3 square mile area. Most of the practice sites are about 30 acres on average. Some are larger than that, but you can see we just have great coverage in this watershed. Major takeaways, this direct outreach model worked. We had to be a little bit smarter about how we surveyed, make sure the communication was there to have everything that we needed so we didn't have to make multiple trips out there. We had to develop new organizational tools just because we're not used to dealing with this many practices at one time. And so we needed a better coding system. We needed a better database to show where each site was at along the way of the design process and which paperwork still needed to be filled out. That coordination was just critical between the survey crew, the designers, then also the funders to make sure we were meeting all the requirements. Flexibility from the funders was very key. We actually kind of started going at this project before we had everything in place, but our mindset was, if we bring all these practices on board, somebody's going to want to pay for it. And so that might have been a little brave, but we found that we made it work because, we wanted to show that, yes, there's interest out there. We just need to be able to do it. And then the new mindset of treating every suitable outlet in a field, we really like that. Instead of, if we had an interest in landowner, why just settle for one, go as many as we could, as long as the site met our criteria. The partners in this, we worked a lot with FSA. Iowa Department of Ag and Land Stewardship provided a lot of the funding for the sites. NRCS did a phenomenal job of actually designing most of these sites or all of these sites. Polk County itself, we're kind of pulling a lot of the strings behind the scenes. And then the Polk SWCD, kind of the contact between the landowners and the project, all did a great job. With that, I'll just leave up this slide for how to interact with ADMC. Reach out to me by email if anybody's interested in projects. We do accept new members, so if anybody wants to become a member, feel free to join. But we also put out a weekly newsletter on just conservation drainage stories. So if you're interested in signing up for that, just let me know, and look forward to our Q&A here.
Excellent. Thank you, Keegan. And I'm going to go back to screen sharing here. And on to Q&A. All right. And some of these questions have been, we've been starting to get them answered live. So thank you so much for doing that. I'm going to go back to one question that's already been answered by one of our presenters in the Q&A, but just because I think it might be helpful for other folks to hear it. And that is from Rebecca Clay. So she asks, Alejandro, and great name, by the way, Rebecca. Alejandro, is there a standard for what portion of cover crop expenses the landowner typically pays for compared to what portion of the cover crop expenses the tenant pays for? And Alejandro, you're on mute. Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, without reading the answer, I would say that there's no quick rule of thumb, but it's just a negotiation that has to occur between the two parties. I mean, we heard everything from from landowners who are willing to pay for some of the costs to landowners who really charge more if the tenant uses cover crops. So there's the whole spectrum, and what do we need to do here is to actually make sure that people have these conversations before and put together a game plan before trying to implement a change in the contract.
Thank you, Alejandro. And actually, Josh has one more too. And the reason I'm sharing these is because for folks that are going to listen to this in the recording, so they can hear a little bit more of the answer. So Josh asks, has research been done identifying the revenue implications during transition years with conservation practice implementation for the operator? For example, no-till or cover crop adoption.
Yes, and there has been some research. I haven't seen lots of research, but some research here in the Midwest. And there are, I would say each specific study has reaches a different conclusion, but focusing on meta-analysis, that is the study of multiple studies, there hasn't been a major impact on the yield of the following cash crop to cover crops in the Midwest. But that's in terms of statistical significance, not that it does not occur. So in some cases, we see a yield drag, particularly after trying to implement a new practice, be it cover crops or be it no-till or conservation till or other conservation practice. There's a learning curve that the operator has to go through, and learning to adjust the equipment, learning to adjust the timing, and so on, might result in lower yields. And that's why it's important to have a game plan and discuss what happens if those yields are not realized. So that's why I mentioned maybe it's a good opportunity to discuss the moving away from a fixed cash rent to a flexible cash rent, where the contract can be based on performance of the cash crop following the conservation practice.
And if I could add something to the cover crop portion on that, just and maybe I can get your insights on that, Alejandro, as well. One thing that we are doing here up in Michigan, we are trying to stop that thought, that thinking where, okay, cover crop, conservation price, they need to pay for it. So people, they always ask, show me the receipts. So show me that works. So the way that we are looking at those conservation practice now, and that's the goal we want farmers to look as well, as an insurance policy. You don't buy insurance policy hoping that you're going to use it, right? You pray every night you're not going to use that, either like with your car, with your house, and also with your crop. So those practices, they do work. A lot of times in your worst year, like if you have a dry year, is where the cover crop might help you. So whenever you have a very, very rainfall, and that might help you to keep to help you also with your field. So I try to run away from numbers in that case, because every single place is different. So what I do here is different from Alejandro does down there, or even my farmer, like literally 10 miles south of me. So if you start thinking as a conservation practice policies, where they're going to be used whenever things go wrong. So that might be the way to go. You pay for policies without wanting to use them. And that's where I kind of try to change that mindset, at least here in Michigan. And Alejandro, if you have anything to add on that.
Yes, definitely. I'm sorry, but I will have to disagree. And the reason is that we do have a crop insurance policy in place, beautifully subsidized by the federal government. So why take more insurance? And farms are entities that need to be profitable. So as an economist, I'm all in favor of conservation practices as long as long-term we can break even using those conservation. So I think they are useful, not always, because even in the best scenario, from a financial point of view, you can break even on cover crops. If there's no rain, then that generates runoff and movement of soil. Then in the early spring, of course, then that cover crop would not be generating any environmental benefit for society. So we have to separate here, beliefs about conservation practice and profitability. That's my take.
Yeah, I do think your point does make sense. The question is that we're going to have a long term, right? So we know that conservation practice, they do work when it comes like in our case for phosphorus, right? So we need to put a price tag on that, right? So if I wanted to avoid or to decrease the chance of have algae bloom every year, I need to put a price tag on that. It might not be a price tag that I'm going to make money in my field, right? But might be a price tag I want to pay, so I don't want that to keep happening. And of course, it's going to have an effect on other people's life and so on. So I think there are different ways to see the same issue under different views.
Yeah, and there are also different ways to change the incentive structure. So some discussion is around offering carrots, chasing the implementation of more conservation practices, and that's what I think we are discussing here. And there's another group of people who think that there should be sticks that we are using. So instead of incentivizing farmers to use these conservation practices via cost share, just increase the price of nitrogen via tax. That will take care of nitrogen runoff, and charge farmers for polluting or transform their pollution into a point source pollution. So there are different ways that people are having these discussions. We cannot really talk to the choir without seeing the big picture.
Yep, great points both. And on the carrot side, I think Keegan, you answered one of these questions, but Amanda's also asking about where did funding for the saturated buffer incentive come from?
Yeah, great question. And so that incentive payment, it came from a couple different sources. Actually, Polk County itself had some funding available. The city of Des Moines contributed a little bit of the funding. ADMC had a grant that we could use that to help with some of that funding. And, we kind of went back and forth on that incentive. And like kind of mentioned early on, like the initial goal was 25, and that $1,000 payment really just came out of like, we basically had this much money available initially. And so it was a round number, and Polk County was pretty adamant that they just wanted, they didn't want this to be a 5-year process, and they wanted to see if doing this incentive would expedite that process into a year, because then they would be saving money on that kind of that watershed coordinator's position moving forward. That coordinator could be focusing on other issues and other practices. Another one of our thoughts were, we want these practices to be available for the ecosystem services markets, and kind of the knock on saturated buffers. If we look at the dollar per pound of nitrogen removed on just the install cost of a saturated buffer, it's very competitive for some of these ecosystem services market, but that PE stamp really drives up the cost on the back end that we don't quite see all the time. So that's one of the hangups of it. So we thought, if we can get these things to scale up to more than 1 or 2 at a time, what does that look like? And do we bring those engineering costs down, and then maybe open these things up to be available from the ecosystem services market? It's interesting. Obviously, it's not a nothing payment at all, but a lot of the farmers, I'm not sure, and we're going to do a follow-up survey to see how important that was to them at the time. Some of them, it probably was very important, at least to get us out there initially, and other farmers, I don't think it really made much of a difference. And kind of just anecdotally, they had a big release on this on the biggest radio station in Iowa on WHO radio. They do a Clean Water Wednesday, which is a very farmer-centric radio station. And we kicked off this project, and all the DCs and the counties that were involved with this, and we didn't mention the incentive payment at all. They said they had 5 or 6 farmers calling into them asking how they can participate in the program, and that was without saying anything about incentives. So we are trying to learn from it and what we should do going forward.
Great, thanks, Keegan. Okay, from Mark. Mark asked, what is the percent cost share for bioreactors and saturated buffers? How sweet was the incentive?
Yeah, it was very sweet. Like I said, they kind of wanted to see what would happen if we set it up one way. The biggest thing that the farmers are on the hook for is they have the 10-year maintenance agreement to maintain this practice and manage it going forward. But they did have 100% of that construction cost included. And then they had to make sure that they're going to have it in the CRP agreement going forward as well. So they'll be responsible for re-enrolling if there's going to be coming out of contract within that 10-year frame.
Great, thanks, Keegan. Josh has another question, and I know a lot of folks ask about this. How was the contact information for non-operating landowners collected? How do you find those folks?
If that's for me, yeah, we just looked at the county assessor page, I guess, and found who owned that land. Some of it, since we had a partner of the NRCS or the local SWCD watershed coordinator, they have access to some of that NRCS information. So they would be making those calls if we couldn't find it publicly available. But
great, thank you. Robert asks, Keegan, where in the process does the farmer commit?
Yeah, that's a tricky one. And we kind of learned our lesson. At one time, we had about 80 sites ready to go that we thought were going to carry all the way through design and construction, but we did lose a handful because people got cold feet towards the end. And I actually didn't know before we did this, like when people actually commit. And it's not, we have them actually sign that maintenance agreement and easement after we had the final design. That construction easement locks them into doing it. In some of the other cost share models, that contractor can be out there on site almost ready to dig, and the landowner could back out, and we'd have to turn them around at that point. So that's a great question. And kind of round 2, we're trying to figure out how to get people locked in a little bit sooner than we did.
Yeah. Okay, great. And also on the farmer side, from Todd, what skin did the farmer have in the project, and what role does the Drainage Management District play in pushing for nutrient reductions? Is trapping sediment a cost savings to a farmer via the Drainage Management District?
It would be, these practices weren't really designed for sediment. In Polk County, actually, the Polk County they manage the drainage districts there themselves. So that did help us a little bit in this one. And then, like I mentioned before, the biggest skin in the game the farmers has really that 10-year maintenance agreement to maintain and manage the practice moving forward.
Okay, great. Thank you. Good questions, everybody. We're on the final stretch here. Rick asks, related to saturated buffers, what, if any, concern was there regarding the slumping of the banks as a result of the buffer? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, that's one of the things we considered, I guess, when we walked the site was a stable stream bank. But I kind of agree. And I think research is coming out of Iowa State that's starting to show that this creating like a slumping bank's really not a big concern, because that water table, that 30 feet distance between that distribution line and the stream bank, that water table is going to kind of taper down to where it would have been normally anyways by the time it reaches the stream bank. And so, on this, we did make sure if it was an eroding bank, we didn't select that site, especially since we had so many to pick from. But, moving forward, I don't think it's as big of a concern as maybe we had initially thought.
Okay. All right. Thanks. And in our final minute and 30 seconds here, I think Jay's comment is a nice one to finish with. And he says, for Keegan, your experience that landowners seem willing to have folks walk their land and then enter into a conversation about possibilities is important. Might encourage more conservation agencies and groups to be more proactive with direct outreach. And we know how important people and relationships are in working on conservation adoption. So I think that's a great note to end on, and all of you are facilitating getting to yes in so many ways. So not only our panelists, but also the folks participating today. So we thank you so much for your time. I'm gonna do our final slide here. Thank you for participating. You can go to northcentralwater.org to access the recording, and please do that for yourself as a reference, or please share it with others that you think might be interested in what you heard today. We also have an upcoming webinar from our soil health team, the Soil Health Nexus, and that webinar is Pathways to Resilient Soils to Achieve Optimum Productivity and Environmental Quality. So we've got Dr. Jerry Hatfield back from quasi-retirement to give us a presentation for the Soil Health Nexus. So thank you so much. Thank you to our panelists, great presentations, and have a great rest of your day.